Okay, we're live. Hi, everybody, and welcome to Data Dialogues hosted by Analytics 8. This is a monthly series that we do on LinkedIn Live where we have a discussion on a relevant trend or topic in the data analytics industry. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kevin Lobo. I am a managing director here at Analytics 8, and I lead our analytics service line. With me today, I have Eric Heidbreder. Eric is a senior consultant. He has extensive experience developing in several different data analytics platforms, including Sigma, which is especially relevant today because our topic is on Sigma computing. Eric and I are going to be talking about Sigma, specifically our experience working with the platform at Analytics 8, some client use cases, as well as best practices using the platform itself. So with that, let's dive into the discussion. Eric, you feeling ready?
Yes, I am, Kevin. Thanks for having me on today.
There you go. All right. So we're going to start with an introduction to Sigma. I know not all of our viewers joining today are necessarily going to be familiar with the platform. So Eric, you've obviously worked with Sigma quite a bit in your project work. So I was wondering if you could give a brief explanation on what Sigma is and some of the unique aspects of the platform.
Yeah, for sure. So I think the first thing a new user would notice coming into Sigma is that it looks and feels very similar to Excel. So it is a BI tool. It's connecting straight to your database, which is great. So users can be confident that they're seeing the most up-to-date data, but the way that people interact with it feels very familiar. And I think that's a key here, like a kind of a key differentiator from some other BI tools where you're having to learn a different way of operating or way of reporting. So other than that, it does a lot of the similar things that BI tools will do. But there's a big focus on self-service here on top of that in a way that does feel very familiar to people. So if people are coming in not familiar to BI tools at all, it's going to have a lot to do with just reporting in general from the Sigma side, but getting down into not just front-end reporting, but how do you build metrics? How do you build new metrics? How can you develop things that other people can use? Mm-hmm. And I think we'll talk about this later, but how do you maintain that at scale? That's because I can feel people sweating already with self-service kind of coming into play.
That's always a tricky thing to solve when it comes to self-service. I think the concept of driving transformation through the use of data analytics tools is obviously a really popular idea. You see that market messaging out there all the time, but kind of wanted to dive into some specifics. So obviously Sigma, as you said, has a really familiar spreadsheet interface UI. And as such, it can really accommodate direct discovery in terms of analytics, as well as the traditional BI and analytics use cases that you typically encounter. But what are some of the unique aspects to the platform that you see in terms of your development work that you kind of view as a differentiator versus other platforms that you've worked in?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that comes to me is, it's just because we're working with it a lot right now, is input tables. And to be upfront about it, right now it's only available if you're running a Snowflake database. Not 100% sure timeline on exposing that to other things, but this is just for Sigma Snowflake. But what's really cool about input tables, even with really advanced, like mature BI implementations, there always seems to be this thing where it's like, well, yeah, it's all pretty good except for this one mapping table that like Joe maintains and has to drop a CSV. And I don't know, for me, it's something where like anytime somebody's uploading a file, there's always potential for it to just tank the whole pipeline. If a column name changes, if they forgot to add a value or something and we didn't validate. So I think the input tables piece is really cool because it allows people to do that within the Sigma tool. Mm-hmm. So there's fewer variables that can change. You're getting a little bit more control over that. Again, I feel like people might be sweating if they hear that like you can write back directly to Snowflake or directly to your database there. But
I definitely see that, especially as somebody who's built like really hacky write-back solutions in my career as a consultant, where it was like, this is just such a pain to maintain and it's just going to break really easily. Mm-hmm. I think from an input table perspective within Sigma, like that's the closest thing that I've seen in a market-leading tool that kind of closes that user loop in a really elegant, clean way where it doesn't require you kind of building some weird extension object or container on the back end, and it may or may not work or degrade over time. The fact that it's built into the platform, albeit obviously the Snowflake consideration is a big one, that's a pretty cool feature to see. I think from my standpoint, one of the more unique aspects of the platform is the extensibility in terms of embedding. We see embedded analytics opportunities and kind of market momentum like speeding up over the course of this year and into next. I think Sigma just being kind of a cloud first tool, it's built into their DNA in terms of the ease of use and how you can embed it versus other tools where it might be different licensing models. There's going to be a lot of technical hurdles in terms of security groups, authentication, things of that nature. I think Sigma, compared to what I've seen out in the marketplace, definitely makes the embedding use cases pretty straightforward. So I think one thing that I was kind of curious to get your take on, obviously you're developing in Sigma, you're also seeing how users are kind of deploying it, interacting with it. So what are some examples from your experience of how people are actually using it in their day-to-day operations?
Yeah. So I think from and just following up on what we were just talking about, the input tables piece, I think that is probably the use case I'm most familiar with, is like the different ways people are leveraging that. And I can't get into like specific details about what people are doing here, but I think anything that requires data to change quickly, mappings are one thing. Ownership information, who owns this thing, those kind of tasks are being done in input tables now, where before it was a file that took hours to track, load, verify, that kind of stuff. So I think that's really cool. Kind of moving away from the input table side, though, what we're seeing as being really useful is the data team. We spend a lot of time requirements gathering, and that's great, but we find that sometimes teams know what they're looking for or need to figure out what they're looking for before they can really say like, hey, here's what we need from the data team. So I think a really good use case here is kind of the discovery piece of like, what do we actually need in the warehouse?
Yeah.
Where people can go in, they can create a metric, and this is where hopefully people will like see the benefit of self-service, but also in the context of kind of strengthening your data warehouse. People can go in and create metrics that you can see. The thing that has always been really frustrating when going into a new client scenario is people are going to use Excel. It's so ubiquitous. It's always there. And it's been around for such a long time. And you know this, preaching to the choir a bit, that people have left the organization and no one knows how this works, where it came from, where the data actually lives, that kind of stuff. So what I really like about Sigma and these kind of use cases where people are using Sigma as a kind of way of extending the data warehouse is we're able to see all of that in one place. We know where it's coming from for the most part. We could talk about some pitfalls later, but we know where it's coming from. We can track it, and then we can make a plan to work that back into the data warehouse and make things easier for people.
And that's a really good point, because I think in most traditional BI and analytics use cases, you tend to deploy to production. You might have like some cursory usage metrics and seeing how users are interacting, or what pages they're on, but you don't actually really know what the process flow is unless you're going directly to them to kind of ask and assess how they're using what you're building. So the fact that you have that ability to kind of see the metrics that they're creating, kind of have insight into that, and just really get a good handle on usage, I think that's super unique, because that's something that, typically as an analytics or BI developer, you don't necessarily get a whole lot of visibility into all the time. So that's a really good point. I definitely really like that example. So I wanted to shift gears. So all things are not created equal. In any data analytics tool, there's going to be some necessary setup. There's going to be technical hurdles, or just things that need to be in place in order to move into development. So our next topic of conversation is going to focus on common pain points. So There are a lot of unique things that you can do with Sigma that we've covered so far. But what are some of the prerequisites that need to be in place from a technical point of view in order to really develop with Sigma?
Yeah. So I am someone who likes to think of we're going to scale this up to thousands of users, like at the front end.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's not the best path, but I think it is really important in Sigma to know who should be able to access what.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really easy early on to say, oh, we're going to have 10 people in here. We'll give them access to all the data because the people that are in here are the people who should see everything.
Mm-hmm.
But then things move quickly. Like I think I've seen Sigma kind of take off faster than people expected enough times to say that is probably something to plan for.
Mm-hmm.
That early on we should be thinking about like what teams are going to be restricted to what data. Some people can connect this easily from like an Active Directory if they have that information already.
Mm-hmm.
But if not, I think it's really important to kind of do that work to think about when people are in here, where do we assign them? What data do they have access to? All of that stuff up front. Because what's the opposite end of this is you get a bunch of people in who are now used to seeing all the data. Then you have to take it away, and they don't like you when you do that. So it kind of damages the trust there a bit.
So basically, if I could summarize, kind of setting governance and protocols in place before you kind of enable direct discovery into everything that you have available in your cloud data warehouse.
Yeah. Especially if you have users who are more technically like proficient. Like if they were the people in Excel who are building these like really cool things in Excel, they're going to find ways to kind of do that in Sigma as well really quickly. So yeah, setting up kind of those buckets of users early on, I think is really, really important.
Kind of curveball a little bit. Obviously, you've been developing within Sigma. You've deployed Sigma. What kind of customer personas or business personas do you see this being adopted by the most in terms of your development work? Like, who's really gravitating towards this?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's like, it seems like the first wave of users is usually those analyst types who are more interested in discovery. So like the enterprise reporting kind of viewer, I will call them, the person who's going in to just view things, doesn't really come along right away. The first batch is usually people who have actively been creating new reports, new metrics, those kind of things. So I refer to that as like a business analyst type.
Yeah.
So I think those are the first wave of people. But very quickly, everybody wants to see what they're doing. So, so those are kind of the people who lead the charge. It seems is not the heavy developers, but the people who are like on the data warehouse side. I mean, but the people who sit on that business analyst side of the equation.
And that's kind of important because those are the types of people that really help to drive adoption because they tend to be the most data literate. And they can be pretty dangerous. And when other people kind of see what they're producing, it kind of inclines itself to natural adoption over time. So that's a really interesting point. So one more question on common pain points. So what are some common challenges or pitfalls that you see customers experiencing in adopting or migrating to Sigma?
Yeah. So there was something I was going to bring back for this, and I can't quite recall, but hopefully it'll come back to me. I do have like a few other things. One is related to browser resources. This is just like a across the board anytime you're using a browser, but browser resources can get consumed by Sigma if you're not careful. And this is in partnership with, I was trying to find a good phrase for this, and I think we're just going to call it death by addition. When you have a workbook in Sigma or a report, I think this is across the board, but specifically we'll talk about Sigma. people want to keep adding to the thing they have. As you keep adding and adding and adding, eventually Sigma is going to reach a point with browser resources and your computer hardware where it just slows down.
Yeah.
And so I think the ways to combat that, it's not like there's anything wrong with Sigma. It's more about really focusing on what you're building, why you're building it, and whether it's still relevant. So I think you talking about the kind of usage things before too, or that's what we were referring to before.
Yeah.
That's huge. It's I liken it to like doing your dishes. Like no one really wants to clean the thing, but you have to at a certain point, or else you just get stinky dishes.
Nobody wants stinky dishes. Yeah, and I think it also kind of puts a lot more prominence on what you're doing within the data warehouse layer, as that's what's going to be ultimately surfaced. So keeping it clean, adherent to best practices in terms of what you're building from a data platform perspective, but also really critical. You can't just expect to, put Sigma on top of like a non-optimized cloud data warehouse and expect it to work. Expect to kind of get those direct discovery insights. There is that part to it where that foundational work is really critical. It's going to be critical regardless of what BI tool you adopt on the front end. It's something that you should definitely be making an investment in. But in terms of the direct discovery paradigm for Sigma, it takes on a lot of importance because you're referencing those tables. You're looking at the tables in the data warehouse. So I wanted to transition to our final set of questions for the day. I know some of the folks that are out there watching this today, they might be just starting on their journey with Sigma. So we wanted to address the topic of best practices that you should think about leveraging when you're getting off the ground in terms of your Sigma implementation. So can you give our audience any sort of general guidance or advice on best practices that they can employ if they're starting to develop on Sigma?
Yeah, I guess the main thing I'll say here is self-service. Self-service isn't just a thing where you push it off to say like, the users are going to do it. It has to be a communication. Yeah. People can self-serve, but then you're going to learn things about what they've built, why they're building it, what they want to see. And so from the data team perspective, that kind of active communication or active involvement in that development process, I think is good to know from the start. It's not that self-service is taking some of the work away from you.
Yeah.
It might help you find more work to do. Especially because, people are going to be going in, making their own insights and tracking. If you're tracking usage, you can see, this is something that people are using everywhere. Maybe that's a candidate for something to move into the data warehouse versus something that was made once and never used. So yeah, I think that's the thing is it is going to be a little bit of a lift when you first kind of unleash the this new thing where people can go in and create their own metrics and that. But ultimately, it's something that I think has to be planned for. If you go in, you're like, we don't have somebody who has the capacity to check this out as it's being built. You're going to look back, a month later and see, wow, they made a lot of progress, and we have to figure out a way to get this back into the data warehouse, and technical debt.
That
accrues.
I really love that point on self-service, because I often see self-service sometimes where it's almost a development paradigm from the data team where it's like, okay, we can pass this off and we don't have to touch it anymore. It's like, that's not how it works. It's not how it should work in an ideal function. So that's a really good point, that it is a two-way street. Even if you're trying to drive towards self-service, that doesn't mean just kind of passing off the burden to the business users. There's still going to be active involvement. So next question, is there anything in particular that you wish that you knew as a best practice, or any sort of piece of advice that you wish that you knew before you started developing in Sigma like day one?
Yeah. It took me a long time to realize that every time I was changing something, it was running queries. There's a pause queries option that I think, like, just from a technical standpoint, from if you're one of the initial folks in Sigma who's building something, pause your queries as you're developing. It makes everything run faster, like as you're developing. It doesn't run queries against the data warehouse every time you remove a field. So those kind of things I think are for the developers specifically. I think that's huge. Otherwise, the more you add, the longer it takes to add or remove things. That's my little quick tidbit from the developer side.
I like it.
Yeah.
I guess, what was the transition like for you? Because I mean, obviously, you've developed in a lot of platforms prior to Sigma. Like, you have a lot of exposure to other tools that are out there in the marketplace. What was the ramp up, or I guess what was the learning curve like in terms of shifting over from what you were previously doing to developing in Sigma?
Yeah. It was honestly pretty quick. Like, I say that this is a familiar interface, but it's also pretty intuitive. So I'm coming from like more of a back end development perspective too. So I'm used to coding and all of this stuff, and maybe not touching the UI all the time. So Sigma, I think, is more UI focused. But everything kind of flows pretty naturally. The hardest thing, I think, was getting the relationships between the different like objects within Sigma, a data set, a worksheet, the table, like a linked input table. All of those kind of like terminologies are always a little bit difficult. But even if you don't know those, you can kind of you could still put something together. It may not be the most performant thing, but I think day one, if somebody goes into Sigma, doesn't even look at any of the tutorials, they could probably find their way through. And that's pretty impressive to me from a UI standpoint.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I think the nomenclature piece of it's always a tough one, regardless of what tool you're using. I can't tell you how many times, like, I'll be in a sales opportunity and somebody's referring to like a report as an app, or like a workspace as a sheet. I'm like, we kind of need to nail down our language here to figure out if we're talking about the same thing. But definitely understand that.
For the next global conference on BI tools, decide once and for all what everything's called.
Is this a report? Is this a dashboard? Is this an app? What are we actually calling it? Can we please come to we build a business glossary for it?
We need to do requirements gathering for ourselves. That's what this is about.
Exactly. So final question for the day. Where do you see Sigma as a platform either growing or evolving towards next?
Yeah, I think they've made some big steps toward embedded analytics, and I can see that growing more mature over time. Right now, it's easy to do from the back end or front end side, and I think that's great. I think their docs are really great too, and I can see that kind of expanding out to kind of build out, to kind of position themselves more in the embedded analytics side, as kind of a leader there in terms of just taking that ease of use that they have in the rest of their tool and translating that over into embedded analytics.
Yeah, and since you kind of covered the embedded analytics piece of it, I think for me, going back to the concept of input tables and like user-derived action within the tool itself, I see the platform kind of growing, particularly within like the workflow automation space, almost, so to speak. I mean, I think there's something super powerful in the sense that you can enter data, you can enter parameters within the tool, you can kind of close the loop, right? And we're just talking from like a data in perspective, but the ability to kind of extend that over time, to build in actual process automations where, like, everybody talks about like build actionable reporting, build actionable dashboards. You kind of have to facilitate the mechanism for users to take action. And they've kind of done that within the platform. I am super excited to see where that evolves to beyond input tables, but like that's the first foray into it. I think that's a lot of power that can be harnessed. Because I mean, again, we talk about it ad nauseum that when you're looking at your reports, when you're looking at your dashboards, make sure that you're thinking of action in mind that a user is going to take. So I think that can definitely be a big growth point within the platform. Anything else? Any other kind of closing thoughts that you wanted to cover?
I guess something we didn't talk about, but something I hold dear to my heart that might not be for everybody on the call is Sigma's API is pretty good. So if you have any like large scale changes you want to make, like we were talking about scaling security kind of stuff, you can leverage the API for that. So you're not having to do it all within the UI. So yeah, there are options for like how to manage this at scale that don't involve clicking through every menu every time you need it.
Any resources in particular that you want to shout out that you think would be helpful for anybody that's joining today as far as getting started with Sigma? Anything that helped you when you were starting?
I really stayed mostly on Sigma's site. So I think maybe I can post the links here, but they have a lot of good like quick starts, they call them, that lead you through the tools, give you some good pointers, and their docs are pretty up to date. So I'm somebody who kind of spends a lot of my time in the docs. But yeah, I think it's not just me. I'm hearing it from users too, that they're usually going to Sigma's documentation, finding things they can do within it, finding examples of things they can do within it. So I think that's really good to get started. And also when you first start with Sigma, they give you some templates. That's another great place to go because you can just see how it's built. And so you can click in and go behind the scenes and see how everything's working. That was really useful for me and for one of our like more advanced analysts here that I think is always really helpful.
Awesome. So that's all the content that we have for today. I really hope that everybody who joined today found this useful and engaging. If you do have any questions after this, feel free to connect with Eric. Feel free to connect with myself on LinkedIn. Check out some of our existing Sigma blog content that we have on our Analytics 8 website. I don't know if you found this fun, Eric, but I did. So thank you so much for your time today. If there are any sound effects that you want to play, now's the time to do it.
Well, I didn't get to use my reverb, but I just got to say that Sigma sounds great when you have a ton of reverb on your voice. Oh, that's not even a good one. Thank you for listening to our Sigma call.
I don't think we're gonna be able to top that. I think that's the best ending one of these that we've done thus far. So thank you everybody for joining. Again, if you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to Eric and myself, and hope you have a great rest of your day.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks all.
Thanks all.